Let's make history. The Manhattan neighborhood, the region of the Manhattan neighborhood, which would one day become the East Village, was originally territory of the Lenape Native Americans, who were a band of people who stretched as far south as the state of Delaware. And they're also nicknamed the Delaware Nation, or just simply the Delaware Native Americans. After the Dutch arrived in Manhattan, they did have African slaves imported. Eventually, some of these slaves were freed. They collectively were granted land by the Dutch and formed the first black neighborhoods, which was where the East Village is now, and also the area of Soho. There was a price to this, however. It was like a canary in the coal mine situation. During this period, the Dutch controlled everything pretty much south of Houston. Everything north of Houston was considered wilderness or native territories or off limits, because you didn't know what danger you faced. These black neighborhoods were strategically put in these locations as somewhat of a defense wall against the natives. That land eventually ended up in the hands of the last Dutch governor of New Amsterdam, which was Peter Stuyvesant. And it stood at his family for generations. Then, in the early 1800s, they began to sell it off bit by bit, mostly to real estate developers who were looking to build upscale housing. And that's what that area was known for during that short period. Some of the land ended up in the hands of the city, who, after a law was passed, decided to make a quote-unquote public square, and that's how Tompkins Square Park was created, also St. Mark's Place. That was short-lived because this wasn't called the East Village at this time. It was technically part of the Lower East Side. So many rich people lived there originally. They began to move out and go further and further uptown to places like Gramercy Park, because the Lower East Side was still affiliated with immigration, substandard housing. In fact, before it was called the East Village, it was known as Little Germany. Not long after Tompkins Square Park was built, Germans began to move in mass waves. All around the park, they built beer gardens. Most bakeries in Lower Manhattan during this time were ran and owned by Germans. And unlike most European immigrants, the Germans who came over were actually highly educated and highly skilled. Cabinet makers. I talk about this in my video on the history of Steinway, which is a subsection in the story of Queens. Take a look at that if you haven't already. That neighborhood was named after one of these skilled German immigrants who built concert pianos, built bakeries, breweries, got involved in local politics, and even helped start off the first trade unions. The next group to claim the area would be Ashkenazi Jews. In the early part of the 20th century, neighborhood became known for many Yiddish theaters and Jewish delis. The early 20th century was also the period which you saw a wave of tenement buildings come up in Lower Manhattan. After the Ashkenazi Jews, in the mid 20th century, in the 1950s, you had the rise of beat culture and the beatnik generation. And this is how the East Village got its name. Beat culture was centered around Greenwich Village. And as gentrification spread its wings, and at the same time, Greenwich Village becoming overcrowded, the rents went up, and many beatniks moved over into this section of the Lower East Side, closer to the East River. So that's how it got its name, the East Village. After the 60s, the Ukrainians are the most dominant ethnicity in the area. There's also a large Polish population, as well as others. But for the most part now, it's claimed by Ukrainians, to the point that today, some maps you will see the East Village listed as Little Ukraine.